As the Toronto Maple Leafs prepare to start training camp, the biggest question may be, how do you replace Mitch Marner? David Morassutti of Locked On Leafs is here to talk about that and all things Leafs next on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here. Welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com and win $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Leafs, David Morassutti. And David, it's been an interesting offseason for the Toronto Maple Leafs, but I guess the biggest question is, how do you replace the productivity of a Mitch Marner?
I mean, it's not easy, right? You're talking about a guy who had his first 100-point season, right? 102 points, a valuable playmaker, played on the penalty kill as well. So just brought that two-way ability. It's going to be a lot of internal, right? They're going to need some guys to take steps forward. You know, I look at a Matthew Nyes. You know, they just gave him a nice, juicy contract extension. He's someone that's going to have to expect it to play, you know, a bigger role. I expect a guy like William Nylander, who, you know, he signed an $11.5 million contract extension a year ago. He led the Leafs in goals. Now I think he's going to have to do a little bit more. I think they're going to have to trust him to take a bigger role. You know, this offseason. I look at a guy like Max Domi, who, you know, hasn't exactly been the most productive forward. You know, he's filled in. He's had to play so many different roles. I'm hoping that maybe, you know, if they can get him playing with Austin Matthews, he's not going to get the Marner production, but if he even can get half of what Mitch Marner provided, I think it's, you know, it'll at least help alleviate some of it. But yeah, I mean, there are not many teams are able in this day and age are able to replace a 102-point player. You know, one that especially left, you know, and you didn't get much back in return.
Is there one player in the Leafs lineup that you think will be hurt most by Marner's departure?
Everyone thinks it's going to be Austin Matthews. There's going to be a degree to it. Like, you know, when he scored 69 goals, he played with Marner and he also didn't play with Marner. So I do think that there's going to be an adjustment to Austin Matthews' game. You know, he's not going to have that premier playmaker. Now, they could give him another playmaker to work with. You know, they brought in Matias Michelli. They brought in, and they still have a Max Domi, two guys who are known as pass first, playmaking type players. I do think I think the obvious answer would be Austin Matthews, just because of how those two work together, and they were the duo for so many years. So I'll probably stick with that, because there's really nobody else that Marner played with that he had that as much of an impact on than Austin Matthews.
What would you consider the best move that the Maple Leafs made this offseason?
Best move? You know, some will probably say the re-signings that they did with Tavares and Nyes, but I'm going to go a little different, because they did make a nice trade kind of a few weeks after free agency, and they got Dakota Joshua from Vancouver for a 4th-round pick, 2028 4th-round pick. Like, you're looking deep into the reserves onto what that could potentially be like a player in terms of a prospect. But Dakota Joshua it's interesting, because he was originally drafted by the Leafs. They weren't going to be able to sign him. They traded him to St. Louis, and obviously playing with Craig Berube in St. Louis, he had really good numbers in Vancouver when he played a middle 6 role, more as a third liner. Like, he's somebody that once scored 18 goals in a season, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but as a guy who contributed on a third line role, playing that limited minutes and able to put up 18 goals, I think is actually pretty good. He had 8 points in 13 games. The last time he was in the playoffs with Vancouver too. So like, he is such a valuable lower in the lineup contributor, which is something the Leafs desperately need. And his type of the way he plays is exactly the type of player Craig Berube loves. Hard to play against, pain in the rear. He's going to hit everything in sight. But what I like about him is, as I said, he's not just a guy that's going to do bring the physicality. He's also going to pot you a couple goals, right? He can find some contributions lower in the lineup. So that's where I do like that move. Is it their best move? They really didn't do that much, right? A lot of the moves were done last year. So I do think that his addition is going to make a difference in helping provide an identity for that third line. So I do think that's probably one of the more underrated moves that they did in the offseason.
How important is getting John Tavares back this year, especially at the hometown discount that he offered the team?
Well, that's it, right? The hometown discount. Yeah, you gave a guy in his mid-30s a 4-year deal, but at a sweetheart number that, with the cap going up, he could have gotten more. We've seen guys, you see what people made in free agency right now out of the term that they got, and Tavares didn't want to do that. He wanted to stay in Toronto, still getting a decent, he just came off a deal where he got paid $11 million a year. He got his money. He's still getting paid. It's not like he went for league minimum. And what this does is it not only allows Leafs to do stuff, have the cap space during the season. If they want to add some of the deadline, they can. But next year, if some of the free agents that we're seeing for next year actually end up to the open market, Toronto's going to have ample amount of cap space to go out and add. Like when we're talking about losing a Mitch Marner, it's going to sting for this year. But if you're able to find a top free agent in next year, you're going to thank John Tavares for taking the contract that he did, because even if down the road he becomes your third line center, maybe there's a second line center that's available, or even a first line center, like 1A, 1B with Austin Matthews that you can go and get in free agency next year. Like it just allows for so much flexibility that it's probably the best contract that the Leafs have gotten signed with one of their current players, because the Leafs finally got the player to concede a bit and not take everything that they wanted.
Training camp is approaching very soon, maybe a week and a half away. What are the biggest questions and concerns you have about this team as we get ready to open camp?
Obviously who's going to play on the top line, who is taking Mitch Marner's spot, right? That's going to be the biggest question for Craig Berube. He's going to be asked about it. He's going to probably try to skirt around the issue until he really has to properly name somebody. That's probably the big one. The other one is, the blue line, right? They have a decent blue line, but can Morgan Rielly bounce back? Is Morgan Rielly, was last year kind of a, okay, not a great year, but let's see if he can bounce back, because he's paid a decent amount of money and the production wasn't there, and he really struggled under Craig Berube. Can Craig Berube find a way to make Morgan Rielly a better player than he was last year?
Do you think that those two can be on the same page as far as the style they want to play?
I think so. I think Berube understood that he's got to let Morgan Rielly be a little more free as an offensive defenseman. Now that he has Brandon Carlo on his pairing, that's what I expected to be. Last year they tried Tanev, but now they wanted that Tanev McCabe shutdown pairing. So if you can get Rielly to play with a Carlo, and Carlo can help solidify that pairing defensively, maybe that takes a bit of pressure off of Morgan Rielly to feel like he has to carry the burden in that role. So I'm hoping that Craig Berube doesn't put too much of the onus on Rielly to be the defensive stalwart of that pairing. He isn't going to be that. It is going to be a guy like Carlo. But I'm hoping that Morgan Rielly understands that he needs to be better. I think he probably understands that himself, but they do really need him to be a better version of himself. I do think, I do think that Berube really respects what Rielly brings. But at the same time, he has, I think, clearly adjust his expectations for a player like Morgan Rielly.
Be interesting to see how that plays out over the course of the season. David, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find the Locked On Leafs podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to us on YouTube. You can find myself on X at D_Morassutti, 2 S's, 2 T's. So you can find me there, and you can find my co-host Mike DeStefano there too at Mickey_Canuck.
All right, David, thank you so much.
Appreciate it, Gil. Thanks.
Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at FanDuel. The NFL season is almost here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your first bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. I love using FanDuel because it fits the way I like to bet. You can use player props. You could put together a same-game parlay or even jump in live as the action unfolds, and it makes every game more exciting, whether you're watching your favorite team or just keeping an eye on your fantasy lineup. So are you ready to play? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet, and if it wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets. FanDuel.com. Check it out today.